Okay. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out on this windy night to our panel discussion on postal banking and predatory lending. I'd first like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. This event today is organized by the Coalition for an Accessible Postal Service and those allies listed on the poster, including SFUO and CUPW Local 580. My name's Eleanor Riley, and I'm a member of the Coalition, and I'll be moderating our discussion tonight. So our panelists today will talk about the many shortcomings of the existing private banking system in Canada and of the potential for a public postal bank to address. So our panelists tonight are Amber Slegtenhorst from ACORN, John Anderson, who's an author and principal researcher at Anderson Consulting, and Geoff Bickerton, who's a research director at CUPW. So after their presentations, we'll have time for a brief question and answer period. So Amber, if you'd like to start us off.
Hi, good evening everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Amber Slegtenhorst, and I am a leader within ACORN of my area of Overbrook. So what is ACORN? Some of you might be asking. ACORN Canada is the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. It is an independent national organization of low to moderate income families. We have over 80,000 members organized into 20 neighborhood chapters in 9 cities across Canada. We believe that social and economic justice can best be achieved with a national active membership who are invested in their organization and focused on building power for change. Since 2004, our members have won several important victories, including provincial payday lending legislation in Ontario and BC, and working in coalition to raise the minimum wage in Ontario to $11 an hour plus indexing to inflation. Other national and provincial campaigns: remittance justice, digital access to opportunities, healthy homes, and disability and social assistance rights. All of our offices offer free tax preparation services as well. Ottawa and Gatineau ACORN has over 18,000 members committed to fighting for change. Like any union or association, membership decides the drives of the organization, while determining that the vast majority of our resources go towards organizing door to door, block to block, and city to city. We began organizing in Ottawa in December 2007. ACORN has been working on regulating payday lenders for almost a decade in various regions and provinces in Canada. We've had success in getting the Liberals in Ontario and BC to regulate interest rates. We were fighting for about a 9% interest rate, and both governments came out with 21%. We won the ban on rollover loans, but now are facing an enforcement problem. Right now, we are working to get the provincial government to produce a real-time database that shows loans to prevent rollovers with the help of MPP Sherry DeNovo. Municipally, our members are working on bylaws across Canada to ensure distances between lenders and licensing and fees. We have had success in Burnaby, BC, in getting bylaws introduced. We are working with Hamilton allies on bylaws, and also in Toronto, we are working on similar legislation. Our members are working on a new campaign in the City of Ottawa for distancing, zoning, and stronger licensing requirements and fees. Our members in Burnaby have won similar laws. Barrie has passed zoning requirements, and many other cities across Canada are working on similar legislation. Society looks negatively on people who keep going back to predatory lenders. You know going in there that you know what is going to happen. But the reasons are not public. I can't go to the bank. If you are lower income, credit could be a shot, so you can't go to the bank. Your credit could be shot, so you can't go to the bank. There's nowhere else to go, no family, so they are loan sharking, and this isn't fair. Why should we not have a decent furniture because we're an ODSP or OW? Why shouldn't we be able to have access to funds for a vehicle or medications for our families when OW or ODSP won't pay for them or cover them? It's not fair. We get stuck in a cycle we, people that use them, get stuck in a cycle, and they don't allow the ability to make smaller payments, and that's how they make their business. We want public banking options like postal banking, and we had a great forum with the postal workers on December 1st about our campaign, and our members learned a lot, and we're excited to work together for fair, safe alternatives. I personally have had to use predatory lenders in my past, and these are my experiences. My first experience with a predatory lender was in 2006, and I went to the cash store down Val Shopping Mall. I was working at this time, but was living paycheck to paycheck, and at that time I had 3 kids, and I had one on the way. Money was tight, and my partner wasn't helping me financially. The company I worked for didn't have benefits, and I had to pay for my own medications out of pocket. I needed a loan, and my bank wouldn't help me, so I went to the cash store. Once you start loaning one of these people, when I went on maternity leave to have my daughter, I ended up defaulting on this loan payment, and there was a 4 to 6 week gap between getting my EI and my last paycheck, so that's why I defaulted. So what the cash store did was they started aggressively going into my account many different various times without letting me know, withdrawing different amounts of money to cover what I had owed. At times, this took away from my rent and my food money. If one of these payments went back NSF, not only did I get charged from the bank, but they were charging me $100 in NSF charge. Yeah. Finally, after some negotiating, I was able to pay off what I owed on the principal amount and was able to get some of the NSF charges waived. This was all done verbally over the phone, and when I had asked for them to put it into writing, they had refused to the agreement in writing. So when all was said and done, I finally got it into writing, but when all was said and done, I ended up having to close my bank account to open a new one because I got tired of them going into my account and was afraid that even after I paid what we negotiated, they would try to go into my account again. So I had to close my account and open a new account. And what ended up happening was I ended up paying over about $1,200 on a loan of $400 or $500. So the majority of that was NSF fees. And I didn't go back until 2013. When visiting family in Toronto, I borrowed money from another cash store in Toronto of about $300 plus $60 for their fee. They at this location went into my account and took the money not once, but 3 times. They withdrew within a span of a week. So they were only supposed to take $360, and they ended up taking $1,080 from my bank account. And I was working as well at this time. So they owed me back $720 and was giving me a really hard time to pay it back to me. Every time I would call, the manager would get nasty and insulting me and told me that if I need money so bad, I should drive back to Toronto from Ottawa to get my money. This wasn't an option, nor should I have had to do that. This brought me back to the cash store down Val. At this point, they had new staff, which was much nicer, and they were eager to help me out. It took a lot of time, but finally, this location out in Toronto gave me back my money, but I had to get one of the cash store's prepaid Visa cards, which cost me $5 to load, $25 a month in a monthly fee to have the card. And it was within a short time later that I had to use this loaning situation again with the cash store because now I had 6 kids and 2 of them had severe medical issues. And medication was costing me a fortune as, again, did not have benefits through my employer. I also was in and out of CHEO very regularly and still am, and doctor's appointments for my son. And so what ended up happening when I started back was I was doing a paycheck loan, and then they started loaning me on my CTB. So I had 2 loans kind of cycling, and they weren't supposed to do this, but we didn't know this till much later on because the cash store had changed their policies from being like a payday loan to being a brokerage kind of company. So they were charging me a lot more in interest, and things just really skyrocketed. And then once my contract ended in 2014, I started having problems paying it back. And I ended up going to a different loan place to get a loan to pay off this loan. I just got into a really bad mess in a bad way. And I ended up actually going out to Cash Street out on Montreal Road, which is one of the ones that we're kind of going against. And at the end of it all, I ended up owing over more than $3,000, and it caused me to declare bankruptcy. So this left me feeling very frustrated. I went through a depression. and a sense of failure and worthlessness. It's not fun having to struggle financially, and not fun having to use these places, because anytime I ever went to a bank, I got refused. So, you know, I got refused because I didn't make enough where I worked, or because I was, you know, maybe a single parent. My credit wasn't good enough. It was always a different excuse or reason, but that's how it was. And I've also had to rely on rent-to-own stores for furniture so that I can have a decent home for my kids. People say, well, why don't you save money? Sometimes you can't, when you're living paycheck to paycheck and you need something to, like I need a dryer. I can't live without a dryer. I couldn't save $1,000 to buy my dryer, so I went to a rent-to-own. Like, it wasn't stuff like little things like a lamp or whatever, stuff that I really needed, and so that's why I've gone to these places. I also needed a vehicle, as my son has got severe asthma and I'm not able to really take him out on the bus, and I can't have him outside too much. So I needed a vehicle to get him to and from his appointments and things. So, you know, you gotta survive. So that was kind of where I went. And so these places in the end are very damaging, not only to us financially, as they are destructive, not only in the short run, but in terms of like taking all of our money and whatever, and being just a really vicious cycle. But they are on the long run because they're damaging to our credit. They are also damaging to us physically and mentally. Therefore, we desperately need an alternative to banking, as what we have now are the only places that we as low, moderate income wage earners and those of us on fixed incomes can turn to for financial help, as the big corporate banks won't even look at us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber, for sharing that personal experience with predatory lending. I'm now going to ask John Anderson to talk to us a bit about his research in postal banking and predatory lending.
Thank you. I wanted to talk to you about postal banking around the world, and then Geoff Bickerton is going to talk about the prospects for postal banking in Canada. And I think that's important, because one of the arguments you hear people who are opposed to postal banking is, well, that can't work, it doesn't work anywhere else, and it couldn't work here. But the truth is very different. Postal banking around the world is very big, very, very big. Postal banking or financial services offered through the post offices around the world make lots of money in just about all the countries where they're used, and they can help sustain and expand post office services and jobs instead of cuts, and provide new jobs and skills. They can provide valuable services, financial services to citizens, and they can also have an important social role, which I'll get into in a moment. They can function in a number of different ways and a number of different models that can be used. And I think we have to make sure, whatever model we choose, that that model remains controlled by the federal government, and that we have a board which is controlling the bank, which is diverse and representative of citizens and diverse groups in Canada. Postal banks, and what's important about postal banks is that they have a real social role, and I'm going to give you some examples from around the world. Well, the first thing is that they can offer services to regions and areas such as rural Canada, or rural regions around the world, and inner city regions which are not served at all, or no longer served, or poorly served by traditional banks and credit unions. And it can offer a whole range of services, not only personal banking services, but also business services. Because right now, if you live in many areas around the world and you don't have a bank or banking services, the possibility of you starting a small business or of purchasing a home or something like that, it is impossible. And of course, getting a loan, as we've just heard, means you're often driven to predatory lenders. Postal banks can offer services to the unbanked and the underbanked, to low-income customers and those excluded from traditional banks. They can play the role, which is very significant, as I'll mention about in the United States, of replacing payday loan type services at fair rates. They can also provide special services to municipalities and help to build much more social housing. than is the case right now, where banks don't really, the existing banks, which made a lot of money in Canada and make a lot of money around the world, don't really engage in that kind of work. They can even provide services, regular services, and specialized services to Indigenous peoples in partnership with those peoples, as I'll show in an example. They can, and lastly, they can provide social services to NGOs and social economy organizations, including co-ops, mutuals, etc. So there's different ways that banking can be set up, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but suffice it to say that around the world right now, there are approximately 1.6 billion savings and deposit accounts through postal banking. And that means that there's at least a billion people who bank through the post offices around the world. It's much bigger than mobile phone banking, which you've heard of, and 93% of the world's national postal systems have some form of financial services of postal banking. Some of the biggest banks in the world, like the Japan Postal Bank and the Postal Savings Bank of China, are postal banks. They're like Japan Postal Bank is the 15th largest in the world. Postal Savings Bank is the 25th largest. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples very quickly from countries around the world. So first of is the UK. And the UK started postal banking in 1861, only about 20 years after the first stamp was issued. And in Canada, we copied what they were doing in the UK. And so we started our own postal bank slightly after. But in the UK, they had a postal bank, and it sort of was run down. But in 1968, under the Labour government at that time, it was reinvigorated, and they established what was called the National Giro, which was a new postal bank. It was the first bank to offer telephone banking services and to offer bank accounts to many of UK citizens. The majority of citizens in the UK in 1968 did not have a bank account. People were paid in cash. There's no bank accounts. And really, the National Giro, which was the post office bank established by Tony Benn, who some people might know, really changed all that, and they became the 6th biggest bank in the UK. Of course, they were privatized by Margaret Thatcher in her last acts of privatization in 1990. Finally, I'm skipping ahead here, but finally in 2004, under another Labour government, post office banking was reestablished. And this time it was established in a different method. It was established as a partnership with a private bank, Bank of Ireland, which is a very big bank in Ireland, but a very small bank in the UK. And it now operates and delivers services as partnership throughout in every post office in the UK. And I guess what's particular about the UK, and there are 11,500 post offices, the post office system is the post office is publicly owned. The Royal Mail has been privatized, so the delivery system is privatized. But the post office, which offers the postal banking, is still a Crown corporation. And I guess what's particular about their service, 9 million people use the post office banking services, is that you can open an account, checking account, and you can also, if you have a card from another bank, you can also use that card and deposit money through a post office. And the post office banking system offered the lowest fee checking accounts. In fact, many of their checking accounts have no fee at all. And this really drove down the price of checking accounts. In Canada, we probably have the highest fees for banking on a monthly basis. You want to maintain an account, they're going to sock you every month for a large sum of money, even if you don't even use your account, you still got to pay that monthly fee. So really the post office banking, we succeeded in lowering for many people to zero those bank account fees, and it's now about 26% of the revenue of the post office in the UK comes from financial services. Secondly, I wanted to talk a bit about, before I get into a couple examples in terms of social banking, was historically was what's happening in the U.S. because the U.S. used to also have a postal bank and had one from 1910. And in the U.S., just like in Canada, 1 in 13 households are unbanked or without a bank account. 20% are underbanked. They may have a bank account but use alternative financial services. So there's really a need for a postal bank and offering fair banking services. And the unbanked, it's estimated in the U.S., pay around 10% of their paychecks in financial services right now through predatory lending, etc., which is more than the average low-income family spends on food. So the postal bank in the United States was established in 1910. It was called the Poor People's Bank. It was very much used by immigrants in the United States who by 1915 had about 70% of the deposits. And it was quite successful for a time, and finally it was, in the late 60s, it was abolished under Lyndon Johnson, supposedly because the post office had to get back to its core business, which was only mail delivery and not financial services. And of course, right at this time, the postal banking in Canada was also abolished during exactly the same years. And of course, there's a doctoral thesis for somebody out there to research that, but I would suspect that the two facts are linked. That the U.S. postal bank disappeared, and then our postal bank disappeared. Coincidence? I doubt it. Now today, postal banking is back on the agenda. There's a campaign for postal banking, which has a coalition of consumer, labor, and community organizations. And it has two big spokespersons in terms of politicians. Elizabeth Warren, who is the senator from, a Democratic senator from Massachusetts, and Bernie Sanders, who's the independent senator from Vermont, and also a candidate for the leadership of the, a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren has said that banks are rapidly abandoning low-income and rural neighborhoods, and the post office can fill that gap. Bernie Sanders says banks don't want you, and what people are forced to do is to go to payday lenders who charge outrageously high interest rates, and advocates that the post office fill that void. The U.S. Service for Inspector General of the Post Office has also championed postal banking in the States. And so there's a really a reinvigoration of that debate in the U.S. around the need for postal banking. And I think that's a really positive thing. I just wanted to, before sort of ending, I wanted to give a couple examples of some of the things that postal banks do in other countries. One of them, which is very successful, is the Banque Postale, which is in France. It's wholly owned by the French Post Office. And what's important about it, I mean, it made huge profits. It made, in fact, more operating profits last year than did the post office as a whole. So in other words, the post office services were in fact paid for by the profits which were made by the financial services offered by the Banque Postale, and has 10.8 million active customers. So it's a big important service in France. But what they do is, apart from delivering regular banking, which is already something to a lot of people, they finance municipalities, they finance NGOs, co-ops. They have 300,000 not-for-profit organizations which bank there. They support low-income housing. They have a microcredit program. They have counseling for low-income citizens. And they have a very low price for a government savings plan where they offer something like Canada Savings Bonds, where they offer a very cheap price to get into that savings program. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the Kiwi Bank, which is the bank set up in 2002 in New Zealand. It's a post office bank, and I guess what's important about that is that it supplies over 70% of the post office profits, of the post office group are supplied by the Kiwi Bank, wholly owned by the Kiwi Bank. So it's very successful, and I just wanted to say that one of the things it does is it offers special programs for the Maori community, which is the indigenous community of New Zealand. So they offer a special mortgage program, and which means that they offer mortgages for citizens who want to build a house on communal land. So something where they take into consideration the fact that before, Maoris could not even get a mortgage to buy or to build a new home. And I'm not saying that we should do that here. What I am saying is that because anything that we should do around Indigenous people should be done in partnership with them. But what I am saying is that the Postal Bank can have those kind of programs with Indigenous peoples, which the traditional banks don't do. Just sort of an ending, I'm going to say that, you know, one of the big arguments that's used against postal banking is that we don't need postal banking in Canada because we've got such wonderful, huge banks who made $35 billion in profits last year, $35 billion. Well, in Switzerland, they have a postal bank there, and they have even bigger banks than we have here, and even more successful banks. And yet, the Swiss post office bank, PostFinance, has 2.9 million customers out of the 8 million total population of Switzerland. So it's a very, very successful institution. There again, they make a lot of profits. A lot of people use them, low-income citizens and immigrants in Switzerland, and they offer programs there again, which the traditional banks don't offer, and they force down prices on a whole series of different programs. So in ending, postal banks can play a really important role. There's a lot of examples out there of the success of postal banks, and we shouldn't be copying, you know, what one of these models and say we want to do it exactly the way they do it. We can build our own model of postal banking, but the idea of having a bank attached to the post office, I think, is a really important concept. Everybody else is doing it except basically Canada and the US. We're about the only two countries who are not doing it right now. So there's a big opening there, and I'll turn it over to Geoff.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I mean, it's pretty exciting. I mean, I know maybe for some of you, postal banking is not the most exciting part of your lives, but you know, but the idea that we can create a new and different type of national financial institution, I mean, that's pretty interesting, you know, yeah. The idea that we can create a bank that actually meets the needs of everybody, including low-income people, including people who need to make remittances to other countries because they're working and supporting families in other places. I mean, I think that borders on exciting, you know, going from interesting to exciting. I think that, and I know we're in downtown Ottawa, so maybe this doesn't have the same sort of appeal, but the idea that we could create a bank that, instead of closing offices in rural areas where people still need their banks, but instead of closing them, we could create a bank that would actually open branches wherever people live. I think that's pretty exciting. And perhaps the most exciting thing is that I believe we have the opportunity to create a bank where the mandate of that bank, the basic core raison d'etre of that bank, will be to promote financial and social inclusion, not to make money. So, yeah, this is pretty exciting. But now, thanks to Amber and John, I don't really have to say anything more because they've made the case for both the bank. But I will say a few things. You're not going to get away with this. Okay, so what is a postal bank? What are we actually talking about? What's that?
Especially given how much we're paying you, you better solve it.
Oh, the heckling begins. What are we talking about when we're talking about a postal bank? Well, we're talking about a financial institution like many that we know. We're not talking about anything like what Amber was suggesting, but we're talking about a financial institution that will provide savings and checking accounts and sell RRSPs to people that need it. provide online banking, bank machines, credit cards, debit cards, prepaid cards, you know, might get into insurance, those sort of things, provide loans, mortgages, perhaps financing for social organizations like social housing and NGOs like Bank Postal does in France. We're talking about you know, investment products, or a range of them. We're talking about foreign currency. We're talking about, thank you. We're talking about services like financial counseling that that Bank Postal in France does a lot of. So we're talking about a full range banks. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the types of financial institutions that people need and use. But why a postal bank in Canada? Well, I just want to digress a little bit and say, why did the postal bank in Canada that we had, why did it disappear? And it wasn't really, it didn't disappear, it was murdered. It was killed off by the large private sector banks. And there have been comparisons done with the United States, and there's a bit of a different scenario here in Canada around this. That after the postal bank had started in 1867. By 1885, it's a major financial institution. Right? Thousands and thousands of people have accounts with it. A lot of people didn't bank back then, though. You know, a lot of people didn't have bank accounts. But the postal bank was a really big bank. And there were branches. There were branches here in Ottawa at the postal bank in the 1880s. Perth, Manotick, you name all the small towns around here, and most of the small towns in Canada by that time. Beginning in 1891, there was a financial crisis. Nothing new. Seems to happen about every so many years. And but what was different is, at that time, the private sector banks began to get an interest in having actual individuals having accounts. Before that, they were mainly dealing with loans, etc., and accounts of businesses. But they started to get into retail banking. So what happens between 1891 and 1967 is quite a story. But the main parts of it are, thanks to the lobbying and the power of the private sector banks, eventually there is a lid, a ceiling put on the amount of money that you could have in deposit with the postal bank. Well, that sort of dampened things a bit. At another stage of development, the government imposed a lower interest rate for postal bank, for the Canadian Postal Savings Bank, than existed in the private sector. In a very later stage, the government instructed the Postal Savings Bank that it could not advertise its services anymore. That was near the death knell. And one of the last things they did is they pulled out the children's program. It used to be a children's program where, you know, you could put your money in an envelope in your school, and the teacher would go and make the deposits, and if you missed that, you could go into the bank and make your deposit yourself. I'm sure that there are a few of us that remember doing that. I do. I remember doing it, but when I did it, it was in a private sector bank, because the government ordered the Postal Savings Bank out of that business. They closed down the children's program to make sure that all those young kids would start in the right way, going to the private sector banks. So it was, it died a unnatural death, but it was a slow and agonizing one in the later years. And that's what happened. And that, in some ways, that can remind us of what we might be up against here. Because when you take on these guys whose power is so considerable, they may not go down easy. So, but why a postal bank in Canada? Well, simply because the banks are failing us, and in many different ways. They're not failing their shareholders. The banks this year made last year, 2015, made $35 billion in profits. Well, that's up from $29 billion 2 years ago, which was a record 2 years ago. So they did really well. They made $100 million in profits every day of the year if you don't include the stat holidays, Easter, Christmas, New Year's. $100 million a day. It's like they win the lottery every day, but we buy their tickets. And that's what happens. It's by far the most profitable sector of the economy. But that doesn't mean that they make that money by providing us some services in a way and charging us at a decent rate. And John mentioned, and Amber has already explained, a lot of the problems with the banks, so I'm not going to go into it. International studies show, though, one of the interesting things about our banks, especially our big 6 banks, is that they have among the highest annual fees for current accounts for students, low-income families, and pensioners. Right? The studies of the OECD banking countries, the banking industries, we have the worst record there, but we do very, very well apparently in serving medium and high income customers. So this is where they put their emphasis. So it's no surprise that we see the development of the payday loan industry. Our ATM fees are among the most expensive, and while our population has gone up by 22% since 1990, 20% of the bank's branches have been closed. So there's a nice little parallel there. So we like to talk about this in CUPW as sort of looking at this issue through the exclusion by the banks with respect to class, race, and geography. In class, I think I really can't describe the situation better than Amber has. Statistically, we have unbanked and underbanked people here that, depending on your definition, go from about 5 to 15%. We have Aboriginal people in the country rank very high with respect to the unbanked proportion of their population, and I'll be getting into a few of the reasons for that. We have, in terms of the payday lenders, well, we now have about 1,400 of them, 1,400 stores, and they're generating about $2.5 billion in annual revenue. Now, Amber talked about why she used them, and I can only add to that by suggesting that there's a parallel also with the growing proportion of workers that have precarious employment and who are self-employed with the need to use payday lenders. If you're self-employed, quite often you're waiting a while to actually get your check. If you're a contractor, you're waiting for a while to get paid. Sometimes things come up, like you have to buy equipment, you have to buy tools, you have to buy things that are necessary to conduct your business. You're very unlikely to have a dental plan or health plans. So some problems with your teeth can knock you right out, and all of a sudden you need to get some money. So there's a growing potential market for the payday lenders, and especially as the banks fail to offer the proper credit services that low-income and precarious workers need to be able to live their lives, or as Amber said, to be able to survive. So they provide a service, but it's the way they provide that service, which is the tremendous problem that we have. It's by no means acceptable that the richest institutions in our country have abandoned the people who need their services the most. And that's what's happening in this country. We have rural exclusion. The CPA, John conducted a study for the Postmasters and Postmasters and Assistants Association. They identified 1,178 communities in this country that have post offices, that have populations that are large enough that they require a post office, but who have no bank. And you can guess where they are located. Well, some Newfoundland has taken by far the hardest hit. 84% of the communities in Newfoundland do not have a bank. So if you're up in Nain, which used to have a bank, you're up in Nain, you got a post office, but it's a 5-day boat ride to get down to Happy Valley Goose Day. Maybe some people know that. There you go. You got it. So there's all sorts of statistics on this, and we have done some mapping where we mapped all the post offices and all of the bank branches in Newfoundland. And it's a pretty scary situation. Well, that exists in large parts of our country in the north. Then, of course, there's just been a tremendous number of studies that have been conducted about the financial exclusion of Aboriginal people. I won't go into those statistics, but there's been tremendous research that's been conducted, and also conducted on postal banking by people like John Anderson and people in our union like Kathy Steiner. So the question I just want to conclude with is, how do we make this happen? Well, the first thing is we should know that we have support. 600 communities in the country have already passed resolutions supporting postal banking. The names of each one of those and the resolutions are up on our website. You can go and see them. If you come from a town that hasn't yet supported a resolution, go and raise it with your politicians. Like Ottawa.
Shame.
Public, the polls that have been done show that virtually two-thirds of the population support it. Canada Post itself conducted a 4-year study of postal banking. It's here, except, well, we'll just pick any old pages here. They look pretty blank. You can all come and take a good look at it. It was heavily redacted. As a matter of fact, you can read the whole thing, and there's really only two pages that are of any great interest that they haven't blacked out. One of them says it's a win-win strategy. It's a win-win strategy. Very interesting study. So Canada Post, it says, has conducted that study. We have a mandate review of Canada Post coming. So in terms of things everyone can do, there's a mandate review coming. It's going to be announced shortly. We're going to need a lot of support for people sending in cards, signing petitions, etc., any organizations that you belong to, getting them to pass resolutions and send it to the review saying that we need postal banking. And the second thing that you can do, and you don't have to wait for the review, is support ACORN's, support their campaign. Support their campaign. By doing so, we can make a difference, and we will highlight the need to change our current system so we can really do something that can transform the situation that we have in terms of financial services in this country. Thank you very much.